Good afternoon. I believe we could start now. I'm happy to welcome everyone joining us today. We are happy to see you all. We are grateful to everyone who was kind enough to speak today, and we are grateful to the interpreter for the effort. We hope everything goes well and everyone will be able to find the right channel for the convenient language. Otherwise, you can also find the guidelines and instructions on the group chat. Also, make sure you can see these buttons for language interpretation in front of you, because we are going to change the languages and change the channels respectively. Should you face any issues, you can ask for help now.
То прошу, не соромтеся, це теж частина
Feel free
нашої
to test the interpretation.
Ви попробували. Чудово. Також у груповому чаті ви зможете
So I guess everyone is fine with the interpretation. Also on the group chat, you can see the agenda for this meeting. We have quite many speakers today. And that's why I would like to ask everyone to fit within the allocated 15 minutes for their inputs. This seminar is an attempt to take a broader view on the worker's portrait of the working person in an industrial society in the 20th century, with the help of overcoming certain barriers and stereotypes, both the geographical and temporal barriers. And this seminar is based on a project that discusses two photographers, Mykola Bilokon from Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region, and about Franki Raffles from the UK. And I believe that they managed to create the incredible images of the people from industries, different professions, from different countries, but approximately from the same time. Very often, these visual resemblances, the striking resemblances in the images of the heroes in this industry, was the idea to give birth to this project, even though they have never met and they never knew each other, and their contexts of work and life were different. They had different resources available. There were different power balances around them. And these are other reasons to outline the challenges for this project and find the opportunities. In this project, we will try to overcome certain stereotypical views and contrasts. We try to deal with the legacies of such two different photographers, and I hope this is going to be interesting. And here I would like to pass the floor to the project leader and the director of the Pokrovsk Historical Museum, Ангеліна Рожкова. Thank you, Iryna. I'm happy to welcome all participants of this meeting. I would like to express my gratitude to all participants of the seminar. I would like to ask Ukrainian colleagues not to ignore the air raid alerts and take care of your safety and try to stay in the safe place. Unfortunately, this is reality. We need to remember about this. This meeting is taking place as part of the project that Iryna announced. It's about the worker portrait in the 20th century, their archives and artistic reflection. The project is supported by the British Council Programme for the Support for Cultural Activity in Ukraine with UK involvement. The focus of this project is on the two collections of photographs. We are honored to see the collection of the person from our area, Mykola Bilokon, the photo correspondent of the local newspaper, and Franki Raffles from the UK. These collections will be the basis for the cooperation of the artists and museum workers. For us, as the representatives of Pokrovsk community, this project is extremely important. In the first place, this is because we can feel the support and cultural solidarity from the British institutions and Ukrainian institutions, the St. Andrews University, the Center for Urban History from Lviv, and the Center for Contemporary Culture from Dnipro. I would like to take this opportunity and thank Victoria Donovan, Iryna Sklokina, and Andrei Palash for their support and cooperation. We as museum people find it extremely important to find the ways to help us work with our collections, especially in the context when the museum artifacts have been relocated to safer areas in the country, and for security reasons, we are not able to work with them directly and in a physical sense. Thanks to the digitalization effort supported by the Center for Urban History for several years, we now have the archive with 50,000 digitized photographs by Mykola Bilokon, the local photo reporter of the local newspaper. Thanks to this project, we can now involve the researchers, curators, and the artists to create the new product and to promote our history. The project would result in the exhibition due in October 2025, taking place in the city of Dnipro, and possibly also in an online format. In our opinion, the project will be extremely interesting for museum workers, as the case of our activity in the context of promoting the collections, and also I hope it's going to be interesting for educators and teachers. I can see so many teachers accepted our invitation to attend, especially from our community. They could use these elements of local history working in the context of the full-scale invasion. Thank you to everyone joining this project and this effort, and I wish you to have the fruitful work. Thank you very much, Angelina, for your welcome words. And here we will shift to the English language. So make sure you chose the Ukrainian interpretation channel and ask for any help if you need. And also, I would like to say thank you to Sofia Androsyshin, and you can write to her directly on the chat to ask for help. She is from the Center for Urban History and is administering this meeting and helping with the technicalities. Feel free to ask for help if you need any to make sure our project is properly facilitated, also linguistically.
Our proper presentations, and I'm very much looking forward to welcome also our British colleagues here, and I would say that they have already done a great job with like research of Franki Raffles heritage, and also did a lot of work with also archiving and exhibitions and different kinds of critical reflection on her works. And I'm happy to give floor to Dr. Catherine Spencer. She's a senior lecturer in art history from the University of St. Andrews. Please, the floor is yours, and 15 minutes are yours.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint.
Yes, we see your presentation.
Great. Sorry, my screen's just gone completely blank, so I'm just going to give my computer a minute to come back.
During
Yeah, it's all good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this workshop today. It's a real honor to be here. I'm going to talk quite broadly about Franki Raffles and her archive at St Andrews, and in particular about two exhibition projects that have come out of this archive. And my colleague Alistair Scott is going to give a bit more detail about Franki's biography and her life in his presentation a bit later on. So hopefully some of the gaps will be filled as we go. And if there are any questions, we can ask them and have them in the chat as well. But I wanted to give a sense for today of the kind of interactions that have happened with Franki's archives, as well as the kind of history of her and her work. So I'm based at the University of St Andrews, and I've been here roughly the same amount of time as Franki's archive has been at St Andrews. We arrived at about the same time in about 2014. And Alistair Scott, who's going to be speaking in just a moment, played a really key role in the archive, coming to St Andrews from Franki's family. And that was because Franki studied at St Andrews in the 1970s. She was a student at the university between 1974 and 1977, and she studied philosophy here. And while she was at St Andrews, she became very involved in the women's liberation movement. She was a feminist activist. She wrote for lots of women's liberation movement publications. And so her political formation happened in the context of women's liberation in the UK and in Scotland. And then that was a really important through line for the rest of her practice. And that really fueled her interest in women at work in Scotland and in lots of other different places internationally throughout the 1980s and 1990s. But you can kind of trace that back to her time at St Andrews. The archive is around about 40,000 items. It consists of photographs, but mainly actually of negatives and contact sheets. So Franki printed some of her images while she was alive, but she didn't actually print a huge amount. A lot of her work was published in publications, often by local authorities, so by Edinburgh District Council and their Women's Committee. So the image that I'm showing on the slide is from a project that she did called To Let You Understand between 1988 and in 1988, sorry. And this was a project that Franki worked with Edinburgh District Council on about women's working lives in Edinburgh. So this was, in a way, a research project where, as well as taking documentary photographs of women at work in Edinburgh, she also interviewed women, spoke with them, and lots of their quotes are included in this publication, alongside statistics about pay, access to childcare, working conditions. So her work was very, very rooted in the lives and in the experiences of women at work in Scotland. And the archive really shows that. So as well as negatives and contact sheets, it contains lots of publications. It contains her notes, her diaries, her notebooks where she recorded meetings that she went to of different women's groups and different organizations. And that research into women's work and women's lives then informs the photography. So it's a very large archive. Some of it's been digitized, but not all of it's been digitized. And it has kind of particular material qualities that really reflect the political work that Franki was doing. So the kinds of people that she was working with and the connections that she made. This slide shows some images from one of the main exhibitions that she did in 1989, which was a project called Picturing Women, Scottish Women in Photography. And this was a project that I've always found really interesting. This was a project where she went into a school in Edinburgh with the intention of documenting women at work, because she identified the school as a place where lots of women work, so as a site of feminized labor. But she was also interested in the differences between women, so in the power structures and in the hierarchies that made different women's experiences very different. So particularly here in relationship to class. So in the notes that she wrote to accompany this project, she talked about the differences in the working conditions between, for example, the middle class teacher and the working class cleaner. And she was interested in the way in which these women actually inhabited very different worlds within the same working environment. As I said, the archive contains lots of representations of the spaces where her photographs were published. This is a women's directory that was published by Edinburgh District Council. And it's kind of a resource really for women. So it contains lists of different groups and different resources that might have been useful to women in the 1980s and 1990s. But it also contains lots of Franki's photographs of those groups. So you start to get a sense of how her photographs were linked with her organizing, with her activism, with the groups that she was encountering on a daily basis. I just wanted to show you some of what the physical archive looks like when it's out of its boxes, when it's not digitized. And I think these images give you a strong sense of how this was a very working archive, in the sense that there's photographs alongside all sorts of other materials as well. There's been so much work done on and around this archive in the last 10 years. I think Alistair will talk a little bit about the Franki Raffles archive project that he initiated and was a first step to the archive ultimately coming to the University of St Andrews. Another important early exhibition was by the curator Jenny Brownrigg, called Franki Raffles Observing Women at Work, which was in 2017 at the Glasgow School of Art. And this was the first exhibition that happened of Franki's work since her death in 1994. And Jenny identified three main projects from across Franki's work in this exhibition. They included To Let You Understand, which is the Edinburgh project I mentioned a moment ago. The work that she did on the trip to the Soviet Union in 1989, and then Zero Tolerance, which was a campaign against domestic violence in the early 1990s. And those were three projects that Jenny identified as giving a really helpful overview of some of the key themes in Franki's practice, and this real interest that she had in making connections or tracing connections between women workers in Scotland, but women internationally as well, and particularly in the Soviet Union. And I also became interested in these connections and started to do some research about this desire for solidarity across different socio-political contexts. And I was particularly interested in the fact that some of the images that Franki took when she was in Russia, in Georgia, and Ukraine in 1989, she then started to incorporate into the work that she was doing in Edinburgh. So what I'm showing on the slide is a booklet that was made for Edinburgh District Council for their Women's Committee, which was part of the council that advocated on women's rights and gender equality. And this was a booklet that was made summarizing the council's activities, the Women's Committee's activities between 1985 and 1990, that includes Franki's photographs. But the image that she chose for the cover was actually an image that she took in Ukraine of a woman railway worker. And I was very interested in this desire that she had to make these connections. And I think this context here is a really important one for thinking about what that means and how we interpret that now. I'm just showing you some images from that 1989 trip, which Alistair is going to talk about in a lot more detail. just so that you can start to get a sense, if you're not already familiar with some of the images that Franki took on this trip with them. But what I really wanted to talk about in the kind of last parts of this presentation, in the last 5 minutes that I have, are a couple of exhibition projects that I've worked on that kind of seek to reinterpret Franki's archive. One of those specifically within a Scottish context, within the context of housing activism in Scotland, in the context of the current housing crisis, and then another one in relationship to an earlier journey that Franki made through Eastern Europe to Asia between 1984 and 1985. So the first one of these, which I thought might be particularly useful, again, for thinking about how we might interpret archives and interact with them. So the first of those is a project called Life Support, which was a research and exhibition project that I worked on in 2020 to 2021 with Glasgow Women's Library. And this was a co-curated exhibition which took over the Glasgow Women's Library in Glasgow, which has been going since the 1990s and started as a grassroots feminist organization and is now the only accredited museum of women's history in the UK. And this was a multi-part show. And one of the things that we did in this exhibition was that we restaged a project by a US artist called Martha Rosler, which is called If You Lived Here. And this was a project that Martha began in 1989 in response to the housing crisis in New York at the time. But this is a living archival project. So Martha, the artist, continues to collect information relating to housing each time this project is displayed. And when we approached Martha to restage this project in Glasgow, she gave us her blessing, but she said it has to engage with the history of housing struggle in Scotland. It has to show that history in some way. And we thought this was a really wonderful opportunity to bring in Franki's work. So we included some of the imagery that Franki took, documenting dampness in houses in Scotland, documenting tenants' rights organising, documenting women's experiences of housing and of childcare and of spaces for child's play. And we included them in this reiteration of Martha Rosler's If You Lived Here. So we included a lot of images of women's groups from across Edinburgh, of protests relating both to housing, but also to education and also to pensions. And we incorporated those into this reinterpretation of If You Lived Here. So the images by Franki, you can see in the slide on the right. You can see that we selected a group of images that we chose to really root this exhibition in the history of housing in Scotland. And we worked with a tenants' rights organisation called Living Rent, with an artist and activist called Joey Simons, to choose this selection of images from Franki's archive and to interpret them for this exhibition. And then the other project that I just wanted to finish by talking about is a really recent project which just had an exhibition last week called Between Women, which is a project that I've been working on with a colleague at Hong Kong University called Vivian Sheng. And Vivian and I share interests in transnational feminist organizing since the 1970s. And Vivian visited St. Andrews a couple of years ago and became very interested in the images that Franki took in China in 1984, in this first big trip that she did between 1984 and 1985, and when her interest in women's work really starts to crystallize. So at this point, Franki hadn't been working as a photographer for very long. She was living in Edinburgh, working as a photographer, but took this year-long trip during which she took lots of photographs of women as she traveled across Asia, and her interest in women's work really emerged. So she documented things like this propaganda poster of China's one-child policy, and she also documented images of women looking at a poster campaign against gender-based violence. So even at this early stage, she was interested in women's experience. So I'm just going to move quickly through some slides because I know I'm pressed for time. But again, to give you a sense of some of this earlier imagery that precedes the imagery that will form the focus of this project from the 1989 trip to the Soviet Union. But just to give you a sense of Franki's travels and the way that her imagery developed. And then I also just wanted to show you some images from the exhibition itself that we did last week. So this was an exhibition where we paired Franki's work with that of 4 other photographers. And we did it in an exhibition space called the Travelling Gallery, which is a bus that travels around Scotland to different audiences and communities. And that's my alarm, so I'll stop soon. But I just wanted to show how we were really seeking to contextualize Franki's work in relationship to 4 other photographers, Sylvia Grace Border, Sandra George, Carolyn Scott, and New Way Yu. Sylvia, Sandra, and Carolyn have all made work about Scotland and the UK, and New Way Yu was one of the first women photographers to receive significant recognition in China. And we wanted to pair Franki's work with these different photographic perspectives of other women photographers engaging with gendered labor. But we also wanted to use this space of the bus as an exhibition space that could travel to some of the communities where Franki worked. So one of the places that we went was an area of Edinburgh where Franki had taken photographs. And we really wanted to communicate, hopefully these images show that, of what I was saying at the beginning about Franki's archive and how it includes this activist material and campaigning material as well as the photograph. So this connection with feminist activism and organizing in the UK, and this link that her images have with that. I'm aware that I've reached my time, so I'm going to stop there. I hope that gives those of you who are new to Franki's work a sense of the breadth of the archive, of this real mix of engagement with the Scottish industrial and post-industrial context, with questions of gender, of women's lives and women's experiences, but also how she was interested in making connections across different socio-political contexts. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Definitely, we will keep time also for the discussion in the end. So thank you so much for being strictly into the schedule. And I think it was really a great introduction, really, which already gives us a lot of food for thought and really to think beyond like borders. And I think the next presentation, which will be Tetiana Kostiuchenko, she's an associate of Pokrovsk Historical Museum, will be actually a very good continuation of this kind of comparison, or maybe just thinking beyond borders, because I think in the first presentation we already had a lot of things which are very relevant actually to both of the photographers. So Tetiana, the floor is yours and your 15 minutes.
Дякую, доброго дня.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I hope you can see my slides on the screen. I'm happy to welcome the participants of this workshop. Thank you for inviting me to speak, because today I would like to tell you about the life and work and art of a photographer originating from Pokrovsk. His name is Mykola Bilokon. Our cooperation in the museum with Mykola Bilokon started in 2019. This is when we decided to invite him as a photographer to join into our photo festival, which was called Zalizniak Fest. We invited him to participate in the panel discussion about the photography in the industrial town and how it works. Back then, it was facilitated by Iryna Sklokina from the Center for Urban History. And also during that time, we had a small exhibition of the photographs and images by Mykola Bilokon. After that, we also had other meetings with him, for example, in 2020, when our museum hosted a celebration to commemorate 100 years of the local newspaper Mayak. Mykola Bilokon worked in that newspaper for over 30 years. During this work, he created his photo lab. He also published thousands of interesting publications. Roughly every issue of the newspaper included photographs by Mykola Bilokon. Mykola Andreevich Bilokon was born on December 19, 1938 in the little hamlet Holovey. Today it is the village Holovey in Dobropilsk region in Stalin Oblast. Today it is Donetsk region. In 1956, he finished the Sheliv Secondary School in the same place. In October 1957, Mykola Bilokon was drafted to the Soviet Army. During this service, he got inspired by photography and learned to take photographs as an amateur. When in army, he bought his first photo camera, Zorki 2S, and back then he started taking photos of his brothers in service, and he even tried to take some color photos. Back then he used it as a hobby, but later it gave rise to his occupation of his lifetime. When he got back from the army, he realized he wanted to be a miner because it was a popular profession at that time with the proper pay. That is why in 1960 he was employed in the Dmitrov mine, which is one of the modern mines in Myrnograd city. He could have stayed as a miner, but a certain turn took place in his life and he became a photographer. Well, his colleague at the mine learned about his hobby, taking photographs, and he introduced him to the editor-in-chief of the local newspaper attached to that mine. They decided to take certain photos to write the article for this newspaper about the complaints of the local residents about the operations of that mine. In particular, they were talking about the facility that was dissolving the concrete as the side product of that mine, and it was located around a residential area. And it produced a lot of smog and dust affecting local citizens. This was affecting their everyday life in the households, and of course, there was a lot of air pollution. When Mykola Bilokon brought the photographs he took, the editor of the newspaper examined them and decided that they were much more worthy than just publishing them in the local miners' newspaper. So he took these photos to the district newspaper called Mayak. This is how Mykola Bilokon met the editors from the newspaper, specifically the editor-in-chief. And that time it was the veteran of the Second World War, Ivan Shkurenko. He was the one who managed to see this talent of a young man to be a photo reporter. This is how their joint work started. Mykola Bilokon was the freelancer and he was engaged on that basis. He was taking pictures and documenting the developments and the events in the city and in the area, and also worked together with Stanislava Bakumov, the reporter of that newspaper. They worked together. And of course, he was taking all of these photos after his main occupation at the mine. Also, at that time, he suffered a serious illness, which severely affected his health. And that is why, when he decided to upgrade his education degree, he could not enter the local institute dedicated to the minery because of his health condition. And at that time, also, a job vacancy became available at the newspaper, and the editor-in-chief suggested that he applies. Even though the pay, the salary was much lower than that at the mine, Mykola Bilokon realized that because of his health condition, he wouldn't be able to continue his work at the mine. He accepted the offer. This is how he started working as a full-fledged photo reporter in this Mayak newspaper. It was in 1966. 2 years later, in 1968, he managed to enter the high technical school. He graduated in several years as the photographic engineer. Also, in parallel, he was upskilling, reading a lot of specialized literature to improve his skills and knowledge in photography. Later, he recalled that he loved it very much to work at the newspaper because he loved taking photos. But also, it was not without difficulties. He had to take his photos in Krasnoarmeysk, Dobropilla, and Alexandrivka districts. This is the huge area to cover. Initially, the newspaper did not have their vehicles available, so he had to travel at his own, and it was challenging. After he took the photos, he needed to print them, well, to dry them. There was a long procedure, and also to get them approved at the editorial office and bring to the printing house. And all of that needed to be done fast to make sure that the photo is published in the newspaper in due time. And he recalled many interesting cases during that work. Once, when he was delegated to go to the Brodivka village to take the photos of the young teacher, the head of the district council of the young teachers, they had an interview. Everything went as usual. They took the necessary photos to accompany that article. But several days later, Mykola had to come back and really retake the photos because the camera that stored the film with those photos was stolen from him, unfortunately. There was another interesting fact that when working in that newspaper, Mykola was meeting with the part-time photo reporters who were the high school students, the students of the teachers' school, the workers from the local factories and plants and collective farms from all over the areas. He was explaining to them how to properly use the camera, how to adjust the light, how to position the people in the frame. So he was sharing his knowledge. Every year, to commemorate this newspaper and printing day, he was selecting some of the best photographs and designed the exhibition at the newspaper. It was a thorough work, as he recalled later, that required a lot of investment of time and resources, but he was always happy to do that. Also, he many times participated in different competitions and contests and exhibitions. For example, in 1975, there was the first all-union festival, art festival of the art workers. And Mykola Bilokon participated in the regional level of that competition in Donetsk city. And he was rewarded with the honorary second-degree diploma. In 1977, he also was awarded with the second place in the regional competition for the artistic design of the newspaper materials. And these are just a few of the awards he received. In 1996, he became the member of the Union of the Journalists of Ukraine. And also in March 1987, he was lucky to participate in the sixth convention of the Soviet Union of the Journalists. It was the huge experience for him, as he recalled, because he had a chance to network with his colleagues. And also later, during the independent Ukraine, when the union was recognized as an independent entity, he was rewarded with the honorary mark of the National Union of the Journalists of Ukraine. The life of Mykola Bilokon developed and evolved in a way that he had to change his job place several times, but every time he would end up with his first newspaper, Mayak. For example, in 1981, he was part of the delegation from the mine building department from Krasnoyarsk Shakhtabud. He was delegated to work in Siberia. Together with his family, they lived in that area for 5 years, and he worked at the construction site. As he recalled later, he really missed the newspaper during that time, and they exchanged many letters. And the editor in chief would always encourage him to return, which happened in 1985. He returned back home, and on the next day after his return, he would get back to the editorial office of that newspaper and continue his engagement. Mykola Bilokon worked in the newspaper until 2005. This is when he resigned and retired, rather. During all of that time, he would document the present-day cities of Pokrovsk and Myrnograd and other places in our district, and took many photos. He documented many places and events from that area, which is the important resource for the research of the history of the entire region. It is also important that Mykola Bilokon was documenting the critical events for the region and for the entire country, such as the strikes of the miners of the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and also the first presidential elections in 1991. However, even after he retired, he continued to keep in touch with the newspaper Mayak, because, according to him, the work in the newspaper meant all of his life for him. Mykola Bilokon passed away on October 27, 2020, and he left behind over 50,000 negatives. His wife, Lyudmila, and by the way, she's attending this workshop as well, she granted these materials to the holdings of our museum and also some of his personal belongings. We are grateful and we appreciate that donation, because we have the valuable photos about our region. We had these negatives and we realized that we needed to digitize them. Our first digitalization attempts were done jointly with the local photographer Yuri Lavrishchev. It was his volunteer effort starting from 2021. And thanks to the Lviv-based Center for Urban History of East and Central Europe, we managed to digitize all of these materials. Thanks to Mykola Bilokon and thanks to the support from the Center for Urban History, now we have the important materials to study the history of our region. I believe it's time to finish my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm passing the floor further. Thank you very much, Tetiana. And I would like to join your gratitude to Lyudmila, the wife of Mykola Bilokon. And also, I would like to thank for the great interview she gave. And I'm really impressed how important it is to keep the contact with the family members of the people in the focus of the research. It's so important to learn more about their details of their work and life. And also thank you for granting all of the professional archives of Mykola Bilokon to the museum. And of course, our thoughts and our hearts are with Pokrovsk, where the personal photos of Mykola Bilokon are left behind. Unfortunately, the developments in the front lines are not promising, but the city is standing, and we do hope, we're not losing the hope that we are returning to that city someday, and we might discover some other collections we have not seen before. And I'm sure this would open up a new perspective, combining the public and the private without this division that is always distorting the reality. So thank you, Tetiana. And here I would like to pass the floor to another UK speaker.
Associate Professor of Film and Television, the School of Arts and Creative Industries at the Edinburgh Napier University. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this. I'm very pleased to introduce the work of Franki Raffles. I hope that you can all see my screen properly and see the slides. I'm going to cover Franki's biography and return to some of the things that Catherine spoke about. Franki Raffles was a feminist social documentary photographer who documented women's working lives in Scotland and internationally. She was born in Salford and grew up in London. She and I met when we were both students at the University of St Andrews in the 1970s, where she studied philosophy. We remained friends for the rest of her life. After graduation, she moved to a remote farm on the island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides. And it's there that she began to work as a self-taught photographer, taking pictures of the women who were her neighbors, taking part in communal crofting work, such as when the sheep of the village were brought together for shearing. Over the next decade or so, Franki assembled a substantial body of work, showing how working life. Yep.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I don't think we can see slides. I don't know if you're doing a screen share. I am.
Right, I have done screen share, sorry. Oh, thank you for letting me know about that. And let me just go back. Okay. Right. And can you see it now? Catherine, can you let me know if you can see?
No, sorry, Alistair, I'm afraid not.
Oh dear. And I have. Okay.
Maybe you could send your presentation to the chat and then I will share the screen.
Yeah, I did send it. Are you seeing my screen now?
No, unfortunately not.
Oh. Oh, I'm so sorry about this. I did send this slide in, so no.
Would you like me to open it?
Yes, could you please?
Just a second.
Okay, thank you so much. If you don't mind, I'll just quickly run back through. So that's first slide. As I said, Franki was a feminist social documentary photographer. Let's move to the next slide. Yeah, and here is the work that she did on the Isle of Lewis, where she started taking photographs of women working with her neighbors in the village. This is the communal bringing together of the sheep for shearing. Over the next decade, Franki assembled a substantial body of work. Next slide, please. Showing how working life for women in Scotland under the free market policies of Thatcherism. Next slide, please. Compared with women around the world, such as those living under communism in the Soviet Union. She traveled widely, not just to the Soviet Union, but also to Zimbabwe, to China. Next slide, please. Tibet, India, the Philippines, the Caribbean, and Israel. But Scotland remained her home. I want to examine how Raffles' archive reveals the solidarity and resilience of women's working lives in different countries and under different political systems. Raffles' career was suddenly cut short in December 1994 when she died aged just 39. Next slide, please. At that time, she was establishing her reputation based on an innovative public campaign to raise awareness of male violence against women entitled Zero Tolerance. She'd created large-scale posters with black and white photographs depicting staged tableaux of ordinary women and girls in everyday situations, with short text highlighting the evidence of the prevalence of violence. Her early death meant that her work remained largely forgotten for over 20 years, until 2015, when, working with her partner, I gathered the entire collection of her negatives and prints, together with personal notebooks, to be deposited with special collections at St Andrews University. The creation of this archive has enabled research to begin to rediscover Raffles' legacy. Next slide, please. And assess her contribution to feminist photography. As a student, she'd been active in the women's liberation movement. And in her notes, she wrote, "I hope that through my photographs, people will see and learn about the reality of life for women and press for change and improvement." In 1982, Raffles moved to Edinburgh and began work as a photographer with a range of commissions and campaign work. Next slide, please. In 1984-85, together with her partner and 4-year-old daughter, she traveled across the Soviet Union into China and Tibet. Throughout this trip, she photographed women in the streets and at work. On her return, she selected images from this body of work to use in exhibitions. Next slide, please. From the mid-1980s, she established a freelance role working with the Women's Unit of Edinburgh District Council. From September 87 to April 1988, she worked on a project to document the reality of women's lives in the city. Next slide, please. And gather evidence for this policy initiatives that would combat inequality and argue for improved childcare facilities. Next slide, please. This project brought together research into statistics on the local economy, interviews with women in the workplace, and a photographic record of working conditions. Raffles reflected on her working methods. Most of my time is spent talking to women about the issues to be portrayed. Without the understanding that I gain from talking to women, I cannot produce good photographs. I want my photographs to show how women feel, and to do this, I have to learn myself. To capture the voices of the women, Raffles used short quotes from the interviews as text captions alongside her images. The To Let You Understand exhibition was launched in 1988 as both a traveling exhibition and a publication, and it toured community venues such as libraries and sports centres. Raffles was determined that it should be shown in places accessible to and visited by ordinary women. Next slide, please. The city of Kyiv has been twinned with Edinburgh since 1989. And at one of the very first exchange visits, Raffles met with a group of teachers during their visit to Scotland. Franki was planning a trip to the Soviet Union to photograph women at work, and she was keen to establish contacts in Ukraine. Having completed the To Let You Understand project, in which she documented women's working lives in Edinburgh, now, as a comparison, she wanted to photograph women at work under the communist system. With an invitation to exhibit her work from a photography club in Rostov-on-Don in Russia, she set out from Edinburgh, transporting the exhibition at the back of her Nissan Prairie. Together with her daughter, she spent 3 months in the Soviet Union at a time when no one could predict what might be the outcome of Gorbachev's policies of perestroika. Next slide, please. Franki photographed women at work in the city, in the countryside, in factories, on collective farms, in the construction industry, in hospitals and schools. Next slide, please. There are over 3,500 black and white negatives from workplaces in Russia, Georgia, and Ukraine. In order to keep up with her schoolwork, her 9-year-old daughter had been asked to keep a diary, recording where they spent each day, and this gives a record of the various adventures they experienced with interpreters, in tourist officials, and with the traffic police. Next slide, please. Franki also kept notes recording her progress, her frustration with bureaucracy, and her conversations with the women she photographed. Next slide, please. Later, when she selected images to exhibit, she used text to provide information and capture her interaction with the women she had photographed, reflecting a reciprocal relationship between the person behind and the person in front of the camera. Next slide, please. In this picture, potato lifting on a state collective farm, a woman in an overall says to her, "Why don't you come over here? Come over and live here. I could get you a job, no problem." Franki said, "I've got a job already." And she said, "Yeah, taking photographs of me." Next slide, please. Anna's diary notes their arrival in Poltava in central Ukraine in the second half of August 1989. They spent a weekend at the Sorochinsky Fair, a traditional event which had originated several centuries earlier. Officially, this festival was banned during the Soviet period. Nevertheless, Franki's photographs of women in national costume and their embroidery and leather craftwork show that already in 1989, this was a proud celebration of Ukrainian identity. From Poltava, Franki drove to Kyiv and visited the teacher she had met in Edinburgh earlier in the year. Next slide, please. On the 1st of September, she photographed the first day of the new school year, where pupils lay flowers on Lenin's memorial. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, and next slide, please. In notes about her trip, Franki wrote, "I'm full of respect for the achievements of women in the USSR. My photographs, I hope, illustrate both the hardships that women in different countries have to endure, but also their strength and power." Franki selected images from the summer of 1989 for an exhibition entitled Women Workers in Glasgow and the Soviet Union, which was part of the 1990 European City of Culture. Throughout her career, Franki used the camera as a tool directly connected with her socialist political commitment. Her early death meant that she never had the opportunity to look back on her own work. Next slide, please. Photo archivist Mark Boulay observed, "One advantage of this collection is, and how it differs from other museum collections is, that we have the entire negative collection. We have the entire print documentation. So you get to see the process of the photographer." Boulay, who was the original curator at St. Andrews, argued that the photographs in To Let You Understand focused on working women's difficulties, whereas the Soviet women workers' images reflecting the empowerment and the engagement by the women could be seen as demonstrating Raffles' progress as a photographer interacting more with her subjects. With the entire creative practice deposited at St. Andrews University, work was able to begin to assess her contribution as a feminist social documentary photographer. Postgraduate students have investigated specific bodies of work, and starting with a small exhibition as part of the St. Andrews Photography Festival in 2016, curators have made their selections from the archive for various exhibitions. Next slide, please. Raffles' work is no longer hidden or forgotten. Scholars are now able to assess the place of her work in the wider context of theoretical debates about photography, on documentary, on feminism, on political practice. Next slide, please. The case has been made that in the way in which she engaged with and documented women's work, this was a form of feminist critical realism. This was photography as a form of social activism, placing at its center an authentic representation of women's working lives and the genuine desire for radical political change, a real collaboration between the photographer and her subjects. Next slide, please. That gives a list of some of the exhibitions that have happened over the past 8 years or so. Next slide, please. And here's some of the talks, the dissemination of research that's happened. Next slide, please. And next slide, please, that's some of the postgraduates who've researched. Because Franki's no longer here to comment on her own work, the only way of being certain of her intention for the work is to go back to a newspaper interview that she did in 1989, where she made her views clear. "I don't want my photos as art objects at all. They're a means to an end. The content of what I'm doing matters much more than the process. I want my pictures to say something, otherwise there's no point in producing them. I believe that by people opening their eyes and actually seeing, then that's the way things start to change." Thank you very much. I'm really sorry about that interruption at the beginning.
Thank you so much, Alistair. It's no problem at all. And thank you specifically for introducing this trip to the Soviet Union and specifically to Ukraine, because in our project, specifically this part of Franki Raffles heritage will be in the center. Of course, we will consider other parts and other travels which she did, which is also very interesting. I think also putting it into this comparative decolonial context, I think that would be very interesting to look at these Ukrainian photographs together with, for example, Chinese photographs and others. But still, context you now provided is very crucial for us. And at this moment, I would like to ask Natasha Filimonos, would you maybe like to go before me, to go first, because I know that you have your teaching quite soon after our event. Could you maybe present before me, if you have, Natasha?
Hi, thank you. Yes, no problem at all. I have some
Yeah,
technical
thank you.
issues, but yeah, I think everything is working now. So I want to echo my colleagues from the UK and say that I feel very privileged to, share this space with you. And thank you for the invitation as well. I'm going to say a few words about Franki Raffles, Franki's last project, which sadly remained incomplete because of Franki's untimely death at the age of 31, which was mentioned already. And I think this project is, quite important in this context because it photographs or it shows women who don't work rather than, women at work, which was what typically interest Franki. I'm going to share the PowerPoint. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So this is a very complex project. So I'm not going, of course, to discuss all of the aspects that interest me and I think are very relevant to this collaborative research as well. But I'm going to focus on the content of the work, though I think that the critical realism that Franki employs in this specific project is quite distinct from her previous practice, but we can discuss this at another time. But also forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Natasha Filimonos, and I'm a doctoral researcher in Edinburgh University, but I've been working on and off on Franki's work since 2015, when they first donated the archive to St. Andrews University. And Alistair was, of course, very helpful throughout the process. So this is the project I'm going to talk about, is titled Lot's Wife. As I said, it's Franki's last project, and it was made between 1992 and 1994, when Franki traveled to Israel to document, what she considered some of the most significant consequences following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Okay, so what is striking and very different, in these photographs is that all the women she documents, she photographs, are sitting in interior spaces. So this is very different to the previous pictures that we saw. So this is here one of these photos. That's another one, another one, and there are many more. So I went to the archive that holds the material of this specific work, The Lot's Wife, and we cannot really tell how many women, or the stories of how many women were going to be included in the artwork itself, which was supposed to be produced in a book format, but also as an exhibition. And by the mock-ups that are left, so Franki created these layouts, and we have 9 of them. And all of them start with, so the fact you can see that it looks like a book. So on the left-hand side, in all of the 9 mock-ups that remain in the archive, you have an edited version of the stories that this the Russian woman, who immigrated to Israel after the collapse of the Soviet Union, narrated shared the stories that they shared with Franki. Also, so that's the left-hand side, the edited text. And then on you have images that are taken, outside, okay, in the public sphere. And on the right-hand side, it follows, the image, the larger image of the interior space, where you typically have a woman or 2 women with their kids, or a woman sitting alone. And on top of each page here, you cannot see it very well. It writes, for instance, Lot's wife, or the story of Marina. So, one of these 2 women here is Marina. Or, for instance, this one, I think, is Nadia. So that would be Lot's wife, or the story of Nadia. Sadly, I don't have a good resolution of the mock-up to show. So the story, of course, the artwork, Lot's wife, takes its name from the biblical story. That's the story of Lot's wife. And the story goes that 2 angels went to inform Lot about the imminent destruction of Sodom, and told him to take his family and walk away and never look back. And because the woman, the unnamed woman, that's why Lot's wife, looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. So, Raffles, I think, makes a suggestion there about makes a suggestion that the women who she interviewed in Israel are dissatisfied with their lives there, and they want to return to Russia, or better, to the Soviet Union, a place that doesn't exist anymore, and hence this association with the pillar of salt and the story. And this is, you can see here on the right-hand side, that's a photo of one of the rock formations that Franki found in the Dead Sea, where she traveled either in 1989 or 1990. There she saw these, different rock formations, and she photographed many of them. And this is where she got the idea to do something like work with this Lot's wife metaphor. So I wanted to say a few words about the interviews of the women that we get on the left-hand side on this mock-up. They're edited down, so this is not the whole interview, this is not the whole conversation, and the whole conversations actually are available in the archive. I think in St. Andrews they still should be, but many of the women there, and I just want to read a few quotes. Many of the women express their dissatisfaction with basically not being able to work. And they say, for instance, so in the story of Marina that we can see now, so Marina says that here I think they don't want women to work. Ada, another woman, says that they don't expect women to want to work. Helena, that's another woman, that I will never work again, but I'm not a pensioner. Natalia, another woman, again said, I want to work and then maybe it would be better. And of course, these accounts resonate with Remenik's research at that time in, the changing conditions of of women of the Soviet Union, and where she highlights as a significant concern this downward, let's say, mobility to occupations that either didn't match their qualifications. So many of these women, right, many of the Soviet women had studied. They were holding positions in education as doctors. The heavy industry, something that was not, something that was not common in, outside the US, right? Women to work in the heavy industries. And this is something that, women touch upon a lot in these interviews that Raffles edited for these layouts. Almost all of them, if not, I think all of them, refer to this. They want to work, basically. They discuss a lot ideas of childcare and how there is not enough state support for childcare in the Israel, how in Russia it was much easier to, leave your kids at daycare and move on to conduct your work in the public sphere. So there is a lot of that in this work, and all the images together are so striking when you see these women sitting the one after the other that they really evoke Franki's commitment to basically we can say universal emancipation, right? Franki was very committed to this idea until she died, but there are documents in her archive that testify to this. And she said, for instance, that no woman is free until all women are free. And this for her really boiled down to this question of class relation. And that's why I think as well that her work is very different than the work that the feminist photography of that time in the 1990s, right? Because from the 1980s onwards, feminist photography in the Western context was really moving towards, what is known as post-feminism, and this insidious, ideology that, all women have achieved emancipation, which was, a very Western-centric and class-based, I would say, misunderstanding of women's condition across the world. And that's why I think Raffles in the 1990s still continued to document the commonalities of women, which obviously I think she located, at work or without work, as we see in these pictures, instead of, engaging with more individual concerns, which was really, the direction that feminist photography was moving to. I think this is what I wanted to highlight. Then I wanted to also discuss the critical realism in this work a little bit, but I think that we don't have much time, right? So maybe it's best to allow some time for conversation. But I think it's very interesting to discuss this project as well at some time if we have the opportunity to see, because I reading the description of this workshop that we're looking at photography from both sides of the Iron Curtain. It would be very interesting to see what are the different perceptions of and research made about women's condition in the Soviet Union, etc. Okay, thank you very much for the time to speak.
Thank you very much, Natasha. It was really very revealing, and I think also very much broadening our perspective to Franki. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And now it's my turn to present. I hope I will not сподіваюся, що я не буду дуже перебирати час.
I hope I'm not going to extend my time. Now you can also have the opportunity to choose the different interpretation channel if you need the interpretation. In my presentation, well, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Iryna Sklokina, and I am the researcher at the Center for Urban History. I am a historian. So my perspective, unfortunately, is not going to be that deep as of the art historians who spoke before me, but I will try to outline the broader historical perspective and social perspective of the work of the photographer Mykola Bilokon. my presentation will be based on the knowledge that he shared with me in his interview, and I was lucky to meet him. And also, I used the rich materials from the photographic collection. And also, for the future research, we could use the research of the photography in the context of the newspaper publications, because here we are talking about Mykola Bilokon as the newspaper photo reporter, the photo correspondent, and his images were designed for newspaper publications, which is a different context. It's not the artist photographer. Of course, photography is art. We cannot deny it even in this context. But of course, in the future, we could really have the research focus on the functioning of this newspaper in the society. We could focus on its possible role as the glue of the society in the industrial town of Krasnoarmeysk, presently named Pokrovsk. Therefore, it is critical to think about the role of the local media in the local community and the role of a photographer in the community. Let me share my presentation.
Працюючі жінки і змінний соціальний порядок.
I'm going to talk about working women and changing social order in the photography of Mykola Bilokon, and I'm grateful to the Pokrovsk Historical Museum for sharing the photos that I used for this presentation. As I have already said before, the idea of this comparative project was born from the striking visual resemblance of the photographs of Franki Raffles and Mykola Bilokon. Even though the photos of Mykola Bilokon of the early stage of the 1970s are rather staged photos, they have been prior arranged in the spirit of socialism, but his later photos more often show different moods and attitudes. They are different from the socialism spirit. They did not intend to consciously really categorize and classify his characters, which brings these photos closer to Franki Raffles. She's trying to show the emotion, the characters types. But also we could talk about the striking difference in the power relations and the genres of this art photography and the reporting newspaper photography. Raffles was the conscious feminist. She was taking photos of the women and the changing of their changing social conditions. Bilokon, as a photographer, on the other hand, was working to fit the social harmony of his community. He was more distant from the criticism of the contemporary times. And of course, the social policy was becoming more evident in his work with time. But his photos, the personal photos that were not intended for newspaper publications, were different. And also, sometimes the newspaper was used as a tool for social change. And we are talking about the phenomenon of commissioned photography, the photographs that were commissioned by the editors in chief, who was a very important person, as we can see from the interview of Mykola Bilokon. On the other hand, we could describe him as a photographer, as a part of the community, because in a little town, because Mykola Bilokon was really locally based photographer, and it's another interesting aspect, which is the distinguishing factor when we compare the journeys, the travels of Franki Raffles taking photos always on the go. She doesn't live with these people she's taking photos of on the regular basis. However, on the other hand, Mykola Bilokon kept living around these people. And also, we could talk about the generational differences. In the early stages of photography of Bilokon, we can see social realism of the Stalin school of photography. Later, however, the photography is approaching the spirit of the international approach, such as the working life portrait. And also, we can see the differences between the East and West, between the two different systems, the capitalism and the socialism. We might also be talking about the differences in the male and female views and perspectives. So it looks like these are crucially different photographers. But as a part of the community, photographs functioned not only in the newspapers. The newspaper was the tool for to be proud of. The photographs stayed in the family archives. In the newspaper, in the socialist times, they were celebrating the common people, celebrating their work achievements. It was not a tool of criticism. It was the tool for social harmony, contributing to social harmony. At the same time, the newspaper photography also brought more sense to the family making, family community. It was part of everyday life and leisure. As we can see in one of the photos on the slide, this is the spontaneous exhibition during a mass event in the park. The photos of Bilokon were exhibited on the ground, on the grass lawn. We can see the less visible part of his photography because he was taking photos of his friends, of his neighbors. Lyudmila, his wife, in her interview also shares a lot about this important part of the community life, of the connections, of the gratitude as a form of socializing. This was about the sharing or sending or collecting the photographs. This is an important element of community life. So the profession of the photographer was a way and the door to enter the world of the political elites or social elites of the district, of the region. And also, he mentioned a lot in the interview that it opened up a lot of financial possibilities, which was critical for socialist society. Because this system of connections and networks and the personal context was important. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I cannot change my slides further. I'm sorry, I'm afraid we cannot hear Iryna. Iryna, can you hear us? I guess there is some internet disruption on her side. Let me check with her through the chat.
Дуже перепрошую, щось сталося з
I
моїм
apologize.
мене чути і видно.
My computer
Вибачте,
went wrong.
можливо,
I hope you can
зв'язок.
see me back again and hear me. Let me continue my presentation.
На якому моменті мене не стало, можливо, хтось може мені сказати.
Maybe you could help me understand what was the last phrase I said? It was actually the last slide.
Перепрошую дуже.
Right. So you didn't miss much.
Отже,
I apologize.
власне, так, говорячи про
So when we talk
цю
about
церемонію слухання на
the focus of
спільнотну
Bilokon
згуртованість, соціальну гармонію
on
і
the
самовисування,
community cohesion and
здається,
social harmony,
якби цей
we
спосіб
should also
представлення цих
mention that
фотографій
this process of commissioning the photographs
поширення, це була, звичайно,
and
частина
sharing them,
редакції газети, як це було
it was the regular workings of the editorial office of that newspaper, which was typical for the socialist society. And also after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the newspaper continued and it was owned by the local council of deputies and the state administration of the district. That is why it was definitely the production of certain desired images. These photographs had to be approved and filtered by the editorial office, but also in the interview, we can learn more about the process of engagement and interaction on the grassroots level, so to say. We can learn more about how Mykola Bilokon was interacting with his protagonists, how he was photographing them, and how it impacted his networking and contacts, and how this area of personal contacts and professional photography were connected. Also, he, as the representative of the power, we could say, he was this way engaging with his protagonists because he was making them public and certainly framing them specifically from the newspaper's perspective. Also, these images for Mykola Bilokon as the official representative of the official perspective of the socialist newspaper, it means that he was having the free ticket into the life of every person. So we can see here the full cycle of life illustrated from the moment of birth to the elderly years and also the funeral. We can see the photos from the maternity ward. We also have some more revealing photographs from the delivery rooms. Also, we can see the kindergarten, the factories. So we can see that he covered all of the possible spheres of life of a person. Unlike Franki Raffles, because mostly her photographs were the street photographs or the workplace photographs. Of course, this may testify to the different access levels of the two photographers. Mykola Bilokon was having these preferences and privileges to enter different areas of life of the people as commissioned by the newspaper, even into some very intimate areas of life of people. Also, we could refer to the traditional or local Ukrainian context or events that was mentioned before. This is the traditional celebration of the pre-Lent celebration, but also please pay attention to this tacit presence of the president of Kuchma on this poster on the wall. And I think this is the good illustration of the presentation of the discourse of power. Bilokon is not making the key focus on that element, but this discourse is tacitly and implicitly present in his photography. As the background, some background poster which is not accentuated, which is not in the center. This poster in the background that is declaring the peace and development, which literally says so, uh, is not in the key focus, but this is still the testimony of those times and the testimony of the constant and permanent presence of the authorities. So when talking about the social change, which I declared in the title of my speech, I think this is something very similar with Franki Raffles. The 1989, when Franki traveled to the Soviet Union and witnessed the perestroika reconstruction time, and also this social change for Mykola Bilokon at that time were critical and were significant because this is when it started. But also, let's take a look at the different focuses he made, starting from the 1970s to the 2000s. These are the official meetings of the leaders, commemoration of the veterans, the continuation and the lasting similarity of the ritual culture, starting from the 1970s and lasting until the 2000s. Certain rituals or celebrations, they last. But also, in the time of reconstruction of perestroika in the 1990s, we can see different perspectives, even though they are not leading here. I was struck by that, and I directly asked Mykola about that. Why didn't he take pictures of the strikes of the miners? Because it was very common in that region. Yes, of course, in Pokrovsk there was no mine available, but he was traveling around, but he was not taking pictures of the events that were the major social conflict and the testimony of the major social conflict in those times and in this region. And I think this is the continuation of the social harmony that is presented, the normalization uh, of that social harmony that is represented in his photography. And his focus on the social tension and social problems was growing. He did not completely ignore that change. For example, in this case, this photo shows the long line, the queue, people are queuing to buy the bread in the 1990s because there was shortage of everything. And however, this is not shown as the critical conflict. For example, this old woman begging for money. And thanks to digitalization, I managed to see that these critical shots, they very often are random. They are just the random photos in between the commissioned photos commissioned by the newspaper, because this picture was found among the photography project for the graduation party of the high school leavers. And in between, you can find this image, which testifies that it was something that struck his eye and caught his attention in between, even though it was not supposed to be made public. Here, as another illustration, we can see how the militia is trying to combat the minor theft, and also the second photo shows the work of the police in the center trying to discipline the alcoholics. And also we can see the more prominent changes taking place in the 1990s. Of course, he could not ignore this. For example, there was this Ukrainian traditions dedicated room that was established in the local school, or for example, the rapid growth of the religious groups. Here we can see the christening, the baptism of the people, also the blessing by the priest of the first day of school. We had this celebration also represented in Franki Raffles photos. Also, the group that was never present broadly in the Ukrainian discourse was the people with the disabilities. And here, Bilokon is trying to represent them. He, as a local community member, had access to all different possible aspects of life of that community. And these are the elements that suddenly became accessible. I'm sorry I extended my time, but I would like to add that these several interesting tensions between the locals and the newcomers, between the permanent stay in the community and the critical view of the outsider or the outside witness. This Thatcherism and the local avoidance of the ideology change or taking ideology as the background of the everyday life that we can see in Bilokon's pictures. And I think these could be the possible lines of comparison or the possible lens of interpreting the legacy of these two photographers. And now, to moderate the discussion, I would like to pass the floor. For that discussion, we still have 15 to 20 minutes for the discussion for Q&A. And you may express your comments or remarks. I would like to pass the floor to Victoria Donovan to moderate this discussion. Victoria Donovan is the professor at St. Andrews and a great partner in this project.
Hello, everybody. I'm very grateful to be here together with all of you. And I'm really happy to be moderating this discussion. We don't have very much time, so I don't want to take up very much space. But I just wanted to note how many school teachers and educators we have present with us. And just if anybody would like to speak to this question, I would like to hear from educators about how they see these collections and this heritage being useful in the classroom. If there are any ideas about that, I think that would be really fantastic. But I invite you to either raise your hands or to write your questions in the chat, and I will come to you each individually. Please don't be shy. Okay, well, I'll start us off then, because I'm really curious myself, and I think this is a question for Alistair. Katerina Volochnuk and Katerina is in the call as well. I can see her name in the chat. We went to the archive to have a look at the Soviet women collection, and we were trying to reconstruct Franki's route through Ukraine. So you said she was in Poltava, and she then went from Poltava to Kiev. But I also saw in the exhibition that Anna wrote about Kharkiv and Druzhba, which are in eastern Ukraine. Could you tell us about when she came to eastern Ukraine and if you know anything about that part of the journey?
So I don't, but I do think, I'm sorry that I'm unable to immediately answer, but I do think that one of the advantages of having her 9-year-old daughter with her and with this school project that she had to undertake is that it is possible to identify where they went. The other thing that Anna did was to collect the documentation that they'd had to have in order to have the appropriate permissions from Interest and with regard to the police about where they were allowed to drive and where they had to stay. There were a number of occasions when that kind of bent, but it'll be interesting. So I think it will be possible to uncover that. My limited ability or non-existent ability to examine that material that was collected at the different points of the journey means that I think that it will, with this collaboration, that will open up that possibility. And I think that's really exciting. I think the other thing is that there's no doubt that, you know, there would have been coverage of Franki's activities. I think that there certainly was when she was in the Russian Republic. There's no doubt that she showed her exhibition from Edinburgh there, and there's no doubt that it was covered by local radio and television. I think the same's probably true in Kyiv because of the link with the teachers who had come to Edinburgh in the spring of 1989, and it would be really exciting to find out. I think because of the glitches with my presentation, we didn't really see the couple of photographs of the school that she photographed in, but that's certainly available online, and it would be great to see if that person can identify the photographs that were taken at that time and perhaps remember coming to Scotland.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think that it's exciting to have part of this archive still unarchived. And this is, I think, something which this project could really make a valuable contribution to, is really helping to precisely document the trajectory, and to also to help to kind of document precisely the locations and the various categorizations of those photographs. And I think lots of people in this research group are really enthusiastic to do that. And I hope we'll also possibly be able to crowdsource some of that information from the very knowledgeable people who might recognize things in the photographs and be able to identify certain places. With Katerina, we were already quite excited to recognize a few places and a few monuments, and to be able to place those photographs accordingly. But Angelina has written in the chat, дуже сподівалися записи Франки, як коментарі до світлин. Мені написали з
I
питання.
really liked the notes of Franki as the comments to the photographs. I received the question, how could we really take a closer look at these photographs with these comments?
Yeah, so I suppose I could just maybe slightly paraphrase that. So how do, and also I would like to ask Angelina, you know, about any of the kind of captions that contextualize Bilokon's photographs, and how those are useful, or how they kind of present certain kind of frames for understanding the images and the historical processes that are depicted. And also, you know, if there has been any attempt to kind of work with captions in Franki's photograph archive, and kind of sort of revise them, or to kind of correct them if they've been wrong in the past, or if this is work that you're thinking about doing in the future. So maybe firstly to Catherine about captions and Franki Raffles's photographs, and then maybe Angelina could also say something about the text that accompanies Bilokon's archive, and what we might do with that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think Alistair mentioned this in his presentation, that talking to women was a really significant part of Franki's practice, and was as important as the act of taking photography. And in some projects, they're really clearly braided with the work, like in the To Let You Understand project, where they're printed in publications side by side. Franki made a portfolio of the Soviet women images, which I should have included an image. I'm sorry, but it contains prints and then kind of is it letraset, Alistair? It's kind of, yeah, letraset, where she herself printed the quotes over some of the images. So she's done that act of pairing the women's quotes with the photographs. And I think for this project, something that will be really exciting for us to look at is that Franki made really extensive notes while she was traveling in Russia, in Ukraine, and Georgia. And they're very detailed, and they talk about discussions that she was having via an interpreter about perestroika and the effects on women, about how different types of work were valued. So there's one conversation that she has with a doctor where I think the context is that she's saying that in the UK it would be unusual to see like a women team in a hospital at that level. And then the person talking back to her says, well, not all work is valued the same here. You've got to understand that there are kind of differences in the way that different work is valued, and talks about the kind of different ways in which cultural work and intellectual work is valued as well. So she was clearly having it feels like she was having increasingly nuanced conversations as she traveled and kind of trying to understand the context. But I think for this project, it would be really interesting to go back to those transcripts. And I'm not sure if there are any original kind of materials beyond the translation in English that she's made. But we can look as well, and we can have another dig.
Thank you. So I would invite either Angelina or Tetiana, who gave the presentation, to talk to this point about text and image and how these and the relationship between the two in Bilokon's archive. Angelina, maybe you could tell us something about the way in which the archive was put. Oh,
I apologize. I'm on my way, but I actually was planning to talk about this. I didn't mention in my presentation. It's very important that Bilokon very often didn't work on his own. He was working with a woman, Valentina Chub, and it was the family friend, and she was writing the captions or the short notes for the newspaper or the reports for the newspaper, and Bilokon was taking pictures to illustrate those notes and reports. So there was the connection, and they both worked together, and this was the joint effort to establish this connection with the protagonists of the photos. So it's very important to talk about that, whether because this is not the work of, the ingenious artist who works in a certain context and has a different relationship to the protagonist. And here we have a different rapport which is built. And what is important that we need to contextualize the photos. What was selected for the publication? What was filtered out? What was left behind in the shadow? What was not considered worthy of publication, and why? And how these texts correlate with the photos, how they relate to them. And it's also very important to remember that it's not only about one photo, it's always about what is behind that photo. Yes, indeed. If I may, I would continue what Iryna said about the newspapers. This is the local newspaper we're talking about. For us, as the museum researchers, it was very important to relocate the archive of that newspaper from Pokrovsk during the hostilities. This is our local history, and we cannot find any such archives in the big cities like Kyiv or Dnipro. So we find it very critical to evacuate that archive. Now we are scanning these newspapers, we are taking photos of these newspapers, we are digitalizing them. And we find it extremely interesting to see those illustrated articles with the visuals provided by Mykola Bilokon. And this is also something that contributes to our understanding of the context. And also, Victoria, if I may, I really wanted to talk. Well, I really liked the story that Iryna mentioned about these random pictures in between that he was taking them. It was very interesting for me. It would be very interesting for me to see anything in the photography of Franki Raffles that stand out, that looks random. Compared to the other photos, just to see something that maybe caught her eye, but was not initially planned in that project. Like we saw that with Mykola Bilokon, something that is different.
I mean, if I may just take this photograph, I don't know Franki Raffles' archive at all, as well as Catherine, Alistair, and Natasha, but just on a first encounter with it, one of the things that really struck me were the photographs, the random photographs of her daughter that are included in it, which are real sort of incredible sort of in talking about the sort of materiality of things. They're a documentation of motherhood and motherhood on the road in quite a sort of ambitious, adventurous research project. And it made me think a lot about sort of what this journey must have been like with a 10-year-old child, and how it actually took place. And, you know, in the diaries that you've exhibited in the Newcastle exhibition, Alistair, you have the wonderful kind of descriptions by Franki's daughter Anna, in which she talks in a very different way about these places that they're visiting, and you can see this contrast between the leftist sort of enthusiasm and a 10-year-old's point of view, being dragged around all of these places and not being very enthusiastic about it. And having a daughter who's a similar age, I can imagine exactly how tough that was. So I think it's really interesting to think about the social context in which these projects happened, and how that is also kind of a manifestation of the politics of the person taking the photographs. To take photographs with a 10-year-old child in tow, you know, is a feminist act. And I'm also interested in kind of hearing Iryna talk about how Bilokon traveled and took photographs, and they were contextualized by a female friend and colleague, is also a really interesting part of this story. So it's nice to sort of contextualize these archives and think of them beyond the photographs themselves as part of a social process that was itself kind of situated in this changing social context, and what all of that means. It's really interesting to kind of think about those dynamics.
I think it's really. I think you're right that bounce of the voice of the 10th. In fact, she's 9 years old and she celebrates her 10th birthday at the very end of the trip. So a very clearly articulate 9-year-old writing about her experience, and really interesting. So that bouncing between her diary and the notes that Franki took is interesting. Unfortunately, maybe not surprising, given how much work she was doing and the stress of driving from place to place and just negotiating everything and taking all the work. Franki's entries into her diary kind of fall away, and there aren't many once they're in Ukraine. And therefore, we don't have as much. There's much more information about the earlier part of the trip. There's lots of information about the stress of getting there, of being on a car ferry and going to Hamburg and then driving across Europe. So there's lots of information about that. But unfortunately, there's no photographs of that. There's no photographs of their vehicle. There's no photograph, because that wasn't the work that she wanted to do. But I do think that the diary has much more potential.
Yeah, well, I think this is getting me excited, because we're working with artists in this project too. So there's a potential maybe to think about how artistic practice could kind of intervene here to reconstruct some parts of the archive that aren't necessarily documented. So that's really something nice to think about further. When we meet next, I think it will probably be to kind of talk through some of these elements of how we can work creatively with archives as well, and think about what possible new lives can be given to these collections. Well, it's already 3 minutes past 4. So I know that this meeting is closing at 4. So I just want to say, I'll switch to Ukrainian. Дякую всім, хто приєднався
Thank
до
you,
нас.
everyone. for
Ми
joining.
дуже вдячні за такий захоплений
We are
відгук
extremely
на наш
grateful
перший семінар. Будь
for
ласка,
this inspired
підготуйте інформацію
feedback to this workshop.
майбутні заходи в соціальних мережах
Please stay
Покровського
tuned about our future
музею
events on
та
our social
Центру
media
міської
pages
історії.
of
Дякую
the Center for
всім.
Urban History in particular. Thank you, everyone.
Ангеліна, ви хочете щось додати?
I would like to say thank you to conclude. It was extremely interesting and informative. It was interesting to learn more about the artist, about Frankie. Of course, we had read around before. We knew about Mykola Bilokon, but we wanted to share about him. However, it was really interesting and insightful to learn about Frankie. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who found the time and joined this meeting.